Can vitamin D really build muscle? Well, if you scroll through YouTube or Instagram or TikTok for long enough, you will find somebody telling you that vitamin D is not just good for your bones, but it is also a really powerful metabolic hormone, that it can redirect calories away from fat and towards muscle, dramatically accelerating your muscle growth and fundamentally rewiring how your body uses energy. All you need to do, conveniently, is buy their supplements. Now, the videos making these claims have millions and millions of views. The supplements being sold alongside them cost a significant amount of money. And the thing is, the research being cited in these videos is real, which is exactly what makes this worth examining carefully. Because real research presented misleadingly is considerably more dangerous than outright fiction. So in this video, we're going to talk about what vitamin D actually does in your body. We'll also talk about what the research being cited in these videos actually shows when you look at it closely, who should genuinely be taking vitamin D and at what dose, what the risks of high dose supplementation are, and also what the evidence actually says about building muscle. So by the end, I'm really hoping that the picture will be considerably clearer than the supplement industry would like it to be. So vitamin D is genuinely one of the more interesting nutrients in the body, and understanding what it actually does makes the overclaiming around it much easier to identify. So despite it being called a vitamin, it actually behaves much more like a hormone. It's produced in the skin when ultraviolet B rays, UVB rays from the sun, hit a compound in your skin called 7-dehydrocholesterol, which is basically a naturally occurring molecule in your skin. And that reaction creates a precursor form of vitamin D, which then travels to the liver and gets converted into a storage form called 25-hydroxyvitamin D. And this is what gets measured when your doctor checks your vitamin D level on a blood test. From there, it then moves to your kidneys, where it actually gets converted into its active form called calcitriol. This active form then travels through the bloodstream and then binds to vitamin D receptors found in almost every tissue in the body, including muscle and fat, and the brain as well, and the immune system. And that last point, that vitamin D receptors are found in muscle and fat tissue, is the biological truth that supplement marketing has learned to build narratives around. But having receptors in a tissue doesn't mean that flooding that tissue with a hormone will produce extraordinary effects. Insulin receptors are present in virtually every cell in the body, but injecting more insulin than you need doesn't make you healthier. It puts you in hospital. Literally, it could kill you. So the presence of a receptor and the consequences of overstimulating it are two entirely different questions, and that distinction matters enormously here. What vitamin D genuinely does, based on the strongest and most replicated evidence available, is regulate the absorption of calcium and phosphate from the gut, which is fundamental to bone strength and the prevention of conditions like osteoporosis and rickets. It plays a really well-established role in immune function as well, with deficiency consistently linked to increased susceptibility of viral infections. Now, the VITAL trial, VITAL, a large randomized controlled trial involving over 25,000 adults, found that vitamin D supplementation reduced cancer mortality and had modest but real effects on cardiovascular outcomes. There is also credible evidence that it influences muscle function, particularly in older people who are otherwise deficient. But the nature and scale of that influence is considerably more modest than the claims circulating online. And it's worth being specific about what the research actually shows. So the study sitting at the center of this conversation is actually a mouse study, mouse as in rodent. And that fact alone should immediately prompt caution, because mouse studies and human physiologies are frequently very different things. So in this study, mice were either fed a normal amount of vitamin D, a very high dose, or none at all. So 3 different groups. The researchers then measured two hormones, which were leptin and myostatin. So leptin is produced by your fat cells and then acts as a signal to the brain that the body has enough stored energy. Think of it like a fuel gauge. When leptin is high, the brain gets the message that energy stores are sufficient. Now, myostatin, on the other hand, is produced by your muscle cells and then acts as a brake on muscle growth, preventing muscles from getting too large. When vitamin D was removed from the diet, leptin dropped and myostatin increased, meaning the energy gauge was disrupted and the brakes on muscle growth were applied more firmly. When vitamin D was pushed to very high levels, the reverse happened. So leptin increased and myostatin fell. Lean mass increased and grip strength improved without any change in total body weight. This has been presented as evidence that vitamin D redirects calories from fat storage towards muscle building. Now, on the surface, that sounds pretty remarkable, but several critical details have been left out of these videos promoting this research, and they fundamentally change what the study actually tells us. The first is that this study hasn't been published in a peer-reviewed journal. It remains in what we call preprint, meaning it has been posted publicly, but hasn't yet passed scrutiny from independent scientific reviewers. It's been in that state for 2 years now. Now, peer review isn't a guarantee of truth, but its absence means that the scientific community hasn't yet validated those findings, and there are specific weaknesses in the methodology that explain why. One of the most significant is that when the researchers measured lean mass, the body's non-fat tissue, including muscle and water and cartilage and bone, between the normal vitamin D group and the no vitamin D group, there was no meaningful difference. The effect on lean mass only appeared when comparing normal doses to extremely high doses of vitamin D. And the doses used in this study were far beyond anything that a human would or should take, equivalent to levels that would cause serious toxicity in people. So translating the results of a mouse study conducted at extreme doses into a recommendation for human supplementation isn't science, it's just speculation, and it's dangerous. And there's also a much more subtle problem with how the hormone data was actually interpreted. So the claim that leptin and myostatin changes translate directly into big shifts in muscle mass and fat metabolism assumes a very straightforward relationship between these hormones and body composition that the data just doesn't fully support. When lean mass was actually measured rather than inferred from hormone levels, the differences were either absent or just modest. Hormones, remember, are just signals, they are not outcomes, and a change in a hormonal signal does not guarantee a change in the thing that the signal is supposed to regulate, if that makes sense. The human evidence presented alongside this mouse study was a type of genetic analysis called a Mendelian randomization study, the kind of research that looks at people who, due to their genes, naturally have higher vitamin D levels and examines whether they show different health outcomes. The finding was that genetic variants associated with higher vitamin D were also associated with being taller, and that's really important. This was presented as direct evidence that vitamin D promotes lean tissue growth in humans. But the thing is, height growth occurs in childhood and adolescence, driven by growth plates in the developing skeleton. It has almost nothing to do with muscle building in adults. So using childhood height data to support claims about adult muscle mass is drawing a connection between two things that are biologically and temporarily quite different. The remaining human evidence consisted of experiments on cells in a petri dish, human muscle cells exposed to vitamin D in a lab setting. Now, cell studies like this are the earliest and most preliminary form of scientific evidence available. They tell us that a mechanism is possible under controlled artificial conditions. They tell us absolutely nothing about what happens in a living, breathing human body where hundreds and hundreds of variables are interacting simultaneously. The pattern here, a mouse study at extreme doses, a genetic association study from a different context, and a cell study is the standard architecture of supplement marketing dressed up as science. The individual studies are absolutely real. You can find them online, but the conclusions being drawn from them are not supported by what those studies actually found. And this is actually the moment to address something directly here. So when a creator on TikTok or YouTube is selling a supplement and simultaneously producing content explaining why that supplement has remarkable effects on the body, the financial conflict of interest is not a sort of a side detail. It is the central context through which the content should be evaluated. So that doesn't automatically make somebody dishonest. Some people genuinely believe what they're saying, but belief and evidence are not the same thing. And the incentive to actually present research like this in the most compelling and attractive possible light, rather than the most accurate possible light, is very real when there is money attached to the conclusion. So a useful question to ask whenever you encounter something like this is, does the person profit if I buy it? If the answer is yes, then the evidence being presented to you in these videos deserves considerably more scrutiny than if the answer is no. So let's talk about what vitamin D actually does for your muscle then. So there actually is a legitimate and very well evidenced version of this story, and it's worth being really clear about it. So vitamin D deficiency, defined as a blood level below 25 nanomoles per litre, although some doctors use 50 as a threshold depending on where you are. This is quite common actually, particularly in the UK and other parts of the world where they don't get a lot of sun. So deficiency is associated with muscle weakness, with reduced physical function, with fatigue, and higher risk of falls as well, particularly in older people. A Cochrane review, which is a systematic analysis pooling data from multiple high-quality trials, found that supplementing with vitamin D in older people who are deficient actually reduced the rate of falls, likely through improvements in neuromuscular coordination, the communication between nerves and your muscle. So obviously that is a very real and clinically important finding. So correcting a deficiency that is impairing normal muscle function will restore that function towards normal. But that is a completely different claim from saying that pushing vitamin D above normal levels in people who are already sufficient will build massive amounts of muscle. One is correcting a deficit, but the other is claiming a pharmacological effect that the evidence does not support. The current NHS guidance, so the guidance in the UK specifically, recommends that anybody over the age of 4 considers taking a daily supplement. So that's 10 micrograms of vitamin D or 400 international units, IU, particularly between October and March when the sun is pretty weak. And to be honest, even that dose could be lower than a lot of the research actually says. And some people are advised to supplement year round. So people who spend very little time outdoors, people who cover most of their skin for religious or cultural reasons, people with darker skin tones, because more melanin in the skin reduces the efficiency of vitamin D synthesis and requires longer sun exposure to produce the same amount. And also older adults living in care homes, because they probably don't get out as often as somebody not living in a nursing home. If you fall into any of these categories, then supplementing at the recommended dose is very sensible. It's low cost and well supported by the evidence. And if you're uncertain about your own level, then a blood test through your family doctor or GP will give you your actual number to work with. And then any supplementation can be dosed appropriately based on what your body actually needs, rather than what a YouTube video recommends. And then going back to these high dose arguments for a moment. So if you're ingesting high dose vitamin D, it carries real risks that are consistently underplayed in the videos that are promoting its use. So vitamin D is what we call fat soluble, meaning it dissolves in fat and accumulates in the body's fat stores, rather than being flushed out in your urine the way that water-soluble vitamins like vitamin C are. And this means that if you take it for long enough, it can actually build up to really harmful levels in your body. Now, the consequence of this is what we call hypercalcemia, abnormally high calcium levels in your blood. And the symptoms include things like nausea or vomiting, excessive thirst, frequent urination, confusion, muscle weakness, yes, and also kidney stones. This is really serious stuff. And in severe cases, it can actually cause kidney damage and cardiac arrhythmias, where the heart's electrical rhythm becomes disrupted and potentially fatal. Honestly, we have seen cardiac arrests caused by this sort of thing in the past. A systematic review in the European Journal of Endocrinology confirmed the supplementation above 100 micrograms or 4,000 international units per day carries progressively increasing risk of toxicity, and that gap between an adequate level and a harmful one is a bit narrower than most people appreciate. And the thing is, this toxicity cannot occur from sun exposure alone. The skin has sort of like a self-regulating mechanism that breaks down excess pre-vitamin D when levels are sufficient, acting as like a natural ceiling, which is protecting you. And that protective mechanism does not exist when vitamin D is taken in supplement form, which is why dose really matters enormously and why the advice to take really high doses while monitoring blood levels every few weeks is not reassurance. It is an admission that the dose being recommended to you sits in a range where toxicity monitoring is necessary. If they're telling you to take high doses but also get a blood test every few weeks, they're telling you that because they know it's dangerous. So after all of that, let's talk about what actually builds muscle then, because this is actually what those videos are promoting. And the science here is not ambiguous. We can't really argue with what these studies say. So progressive resistance training is the primary driver of muscle growth. So when a muscle is placed under mechanical load, so during weightlifting or body weight exercise or any form of resistance work, and that could even be just body weight squats, small amounts of damage occur at the level of the muscle fiber. The body repairs that damage and then adds additional proteins to the fiber to make it more capable of handling the same load in the future. So your muscle gets a tiny bit bigger each time. So repeat that process consistently over time, progressively increasing the challenge or the weight, and that muscle will grow. The Heritage Family Study and decades of exercise physiology research confirms this mechanism unequivocally, and I'll put some research links in the description below. The second requirement is dietary protein, specifically consuming enough of the essential amino acids that serve as the raw material for muscle protein synthesis. A meta-analysis in the British Journal of Sports Medicine covering 49 randomized control trials found that protein supplementation significantly increased muscle mass and strength during resistance training, with the most pronounced effects in people who were not already eating adequate protein. But again, as I always say, if you can get the right amount of protein from your food, from whole food sources, then you're getting so many other benefits that the protein supplement on its own doesn't give you. The third one is sleep, because the majority of muscle repair and the release of growth hormone, one of the body's primary anabolic signals, occurs during deep sleep. And the fourth one is sufficient calorie intake, because the body will not prioritize building new tissue when it is significantly short of energy. So these four variables, training stimulus, protein, sleep, and energy availability, are what the evidence consistently and reproducibly identifies as the driver of muscle growth. Vitamin D at any dose does not displace or rival any of those four things. What adequate vitamin D does is ensure the biological machinery required for normal muscle function is not being undermined by deficiency. That is the role of vitamin D. It's an important role, but it's not the role being claimed in these videos that are promoting high vitamin D supplementation. So for me, the honest summary of this entire story around vitamin D and muscle is this. If you are deficient, which is pretty common in the UK and entirely worth addressing, correcting that deficiency will probably improve how your muscles function, reduce your falls risk if you're a bit older, supports your immune system, and also protect your bone density. That is pretty important and worth doing. The way to correct it, though, is with the doses that the NHS recommends and with a blood test as well. Ideally, alongside sensible sun exposure when the season allows, and also dietary sources including oily fish and eggs as well. What the evidence doesn't support is this idea that pushing vitamin D above normal levels in people who are already sufficient will redirect your metabolism, suppress your myostatin, and produce really big muscle growth beyond what training and protein can achieve. That claim rests on a preprint mouse study conducted at very extreme, dangerous doses, also a genetic association drawn from childhood height data, and also a cell culture experiment. There is not a single randomized control trial in humans that has demonstrated this effect. The supplements being sold on the back of this evidence are expensive. The doses being recommended to you carry real genuine health risks, and the people selling them know that most of their audience will never ever read the studies that they talk about. And that is precisely the problem.